a Catholic intellectual, writer, editor, political commentator, Mr. E. Michael Jones. Good evening.
Good evening, Tony.
Well, I wanted to talk to you about economics, banking in particular, and then after we can switch to science, inspired with your new article. Okay. So let's start with the economic issues. So what I really remembered is your statement from one of your recent videos, where you say that that non-usurious banking is an oxymoron in itself. So that is a powerful statement that was regarded as common sense during some millennia of Christendom in Europe. Can you explain maybe the reasoning behind it?
Banks are in the business of charging compound interest. That's known as usury. So it can't be a bank unless it charges compound interest. In my book, Barren Metal, I talked about the rise of this in Europe over the course of the late Middle Ages. Italy was the center of just about everything of importance during this period of time. If we're talking about 15th century, let's say, 14th and 15th century. They were the cutting edge of manufacturing, in particular cloth manufacturing, which became the basis for the money economy of Europe, which was emerging at this time. Before this time, you had people who could live without much contact with money. If you're talking about the feudal system, the serf owed labor to the owner, and he paid the landowner in labor. So a certain number of days a week or a certain number of days per year, and that's how he paid the landowner. At a certain point, the landowners decided they wanted money. It had to do with the rise of the city and the rise of economic exchange. And at this point, the serf had to come up with money to pay his taxes. And at that point, there was a huge demand on money. And at this point, the only people who had the money available were the Jews, who were tolerated lending money, which was lending money at interest. Interest was at this point 43.33% annually. So it was by every definition possible usurious. And the oligarchs in Florence, for example, which I begin with, talk about in detail, in particular Cosimo de' Medici, who was the head of a large banking family, which became a large cloth manufacturing family in Florence, became the president or the chief executive in Florence in 1429. And when he did this, he invited the Jews in. They had been expelled. They were invited back. And he invited the Jews in because he was not going to raise wages. He was going to make sure that wages did not go up. And the people who had to pay taxes, the citizens in Florence who had to pay taxes, would then have to borrow money from the Jews in order to pay taxes. This was the beginning of, I would say, modern usury. The banking system began in Italy as we know it. All of these economic breakthroughs, like double entry bookkeeping, all began in Italy between cities like Florence and Venice. Venice became the capital for intelligent Europeans who wanted to learn all of these arcane techniques of how to make money. One of them was the Anton Fugger, your namesake, who went to Venice and just was so struck with Italian culture, then went back to Germany, and then they eventually succeeded the Medici as the richest family. So you established a precedent here that basically money is going to be created by the usurer. Money is going to be created by the lender. Money is going to be created by the bank. Eventually, the Jewish usurers were succeeded by a bank. The first bank was in Holland. There was another bank. The Bank of England was founded after that. And at this point, basically, the precedent was set that the monetary creation was a function of the bank, which was owned privately. Now, before this, in both Florence and in Venice, the state did money. Money at this point was gold and silver. in order to be considered a reputable promoter of trade, you had to have a currency. And so the Florence created the florin, which was an ounce of gold, and Venice created the ducat, which was an ounce of gold. And you could depend on these. They were honest coins, and so therefore you could depend on them. This immediately subsumed into banking when it didn't have to be. It could be, what is a coin? What is a coin? What is money? Let's go back to the coin, which was the basic sense of money at the point. The coin was basically some gold metal that was stamped with the image of the sovereign. What that meant was that the sovereign stood behind that piece of metal and guaranteed that it was what it said it was. In other words, an ounce of a certain refined quality of gold. Over the period of time, the Europeans began to realize that it didn't really have to be gold, because what we're really talking about is the sovereign. Does this, whatever it is, have the backing of the sovereign, so that he will guarantee that you will get what you're claiming to be paid for here? That became the crucial thing, and eventually it became clear that it didn't have to be gold. First man to try this out was John Law in France. You could put out a piece of paper, as long as the piece of paper had a picture on it, and as long as the sovereign guaranteed and enforced by law that you had to accept this as payment for debts or taxes or exchange, it was money. That experiment failed because, as was always the problem with paper money, they always overissued it and it became inflationary and it destroyed itself. That's kind of the principle here of why banking is usurious, why that's a contradiction in terms, but also why we're dealing with essentially different things here. The money and the bank are two different things, and they don't have to be associated with each other as they have been. They can be separated. And the best example I can give you right now of the separation of money and banking is Hungary. Just a day or two ago, Hungary announced that any woman that has 4 children will not have to pay income tax. Any family that has 4 children will not have to pay income tax. What is it? What is this saying? What is the meaning of this? The meaning here is that the government is basically creating money and putting it in the pockets of a certain group of people, directly in their pockets, without any bank as the medium of exchange or the intermediary. This could happen across the board, okay? But it doesn't happen because the bankers, in a sense, control the economy, and they have ever since, I would say, the Middle Ages.
Okay, you're right. There are two problems. One is basically giving the function that the state used to have. It's minting money. And the other problem is the lending of some value of some property. So that there exists also a secular explanation why usury is bad, and it's revolving about the morality of dealing with your property. So basically, the rationale for let's say the non-religious argument goes that if you have some valuable property, something like a big lump of gold or anything, if you just want to keep it safe or to preserve it, to keep it secure, it costs you money. You have to pay somebody to keep it, or you have to pay some money in order to keep it. And in the other event, if you want to invest it, in that case you have to take responsibilities for your action. If you invest it properly, you get some return, but if you don't, right, you can lose it all. So what usury is basically a combination that gets the worst of both worlds. So basically, the bank gives you money, and the state is enforcing for the bank to get back to be some kind of a secure placement of property. And on the other hand, the bank has the right to collect profits. I mean, it's a win-win for the bank,
Right.
or for the creditor.
So with the rise of the monetary economy in Italy, the people were being oppressed, and the new religious orders, in particular the Dominicans and the Franciscans, recognized this oppression, and their preachers preached against it. So we had in Florence great preachers who said, basically understood what was going on and said, basically usury kills both charity and business. Why does usury kill business? Well, because if you can get a good return with no risk, why would you risk your money? And all business involves risk, and so the church concluded that the only reason you deserve a return is if you share risk, and the only way you share risk is by something like stock in a company or something like that. There is no shared risk in a loan. So if I lend you money, if I invest in your vineyard and we expand it, and suddenly all the grapes die, I don't get a return on my investment because I'm sharing the risk. If you go to the bank and you borrow money to do the same thing, you have to pay it back no matter whether all your grapes die or not. You're on the hook. You got to pay it back, and that's the way usurers basically acquire property. There is no risk. There's no shares in a loan. If you have a bad time, I take your property. Sorry, you missed one payment. I own your property now. Goodbye.
Yeah, that's right.
That's the injustice in this system. And so the situation in Italy, the Franciscans were adamant when they tried to create the alternative to the Jewish bankers. They created something called the Monte di Pietà, which was a pawn shop for poor people that charged 5%, which was controversy because is it interest, is it a fee? And there was big controversy back and forth. But the Franciscans at this time said, if we're going to start a Monte di Pietà in your city, you have to expel the Jews. Why do you do that? Well, because the Jews are lending money at 43 1/3%. Well, okay, so what? You'll undercut them. No, that's not the point here. The point here is, where did the Jews get their money? Well, there were rich people in that city who would go to them by night and give them their money, and they would get 20% return on their investment because the Jew was getting 43 1/3%. And so as a result, there was no incentive whatsoever to invest in any business, okay? You want to expand your cloth business? Sorry, I'm not going to risk my money with you when I can get 20% guaranteed from the Jew. So as a result, it was a kind of deal. You have to expel the Jews if you want a Monte di Pietà. This was always the Achilles heel of every principality in Europe, because basically the Jew would come in and say to the prince, we'll lend you, you can borrow at 10%. If you let us set up our own business where we charge everyone 43 1/3%. And St. John Capistrano traveled all around Europe preaching against the privileges of the Jews. That's what he meant. Princes letting them in so that they could exploit their own people.
Okay, we're not talking about, let's say, this southern part of Europe. So you had all these preachers like Savonarola and a number of others that spoke against usury, and you have all these Monte Pietas that were those were basically non-profit lending operations. So there was a fee. Yeah, there was a fee, but the fee was used to pay the guys working there, because somebody had to sit there, a clerk that would write the papers, give you stuff, and those fee should have had. I mean, probably there were all kinds of stories, but the principle was that the fee covers the costs of the building, of the clerks, and of maintaining the operation, and there was no profit extracted from lending the money. But on the other hand, in the north, let's say in the German world, well, basically you didn't have this sensibility. I mean, it's like if there was a general lacking of these preachers preaching against usury, except Martin Luther, and the main banker was the Fugger family, the main usurer. So I see the Reformation disaster in fact, as one of the consequences of the church mishandling this situation in the north. You have basically a Catholic usurer. You have one powerful preacher against usury, and then official theologian comes and he covers for the usurer. And so the result, one of the result was the breaking of Christianity, basically.
I think you're right. I think that basically what the church should have done was expand Savonarola's reforms in Florence to the entire church. In other words, clean up sodomy, clean up usury, clean up the church. And the church cardinals were at the heart of the problem because they were wealthy men and they were going to the Jew by night, and the Jew was keeping their money for them and paying them 20%. And the Fuggers succeeded this, and they were doing the same way. In addition to that, the Fuggers were also the agents for the Vatican in the German lands where they were collecting money for indulgences. And so people like Luther was part of this, but a man like Ulrich von Hutten was a minor aristocrat at a time when suddenly the middle class and the merchant class is outstripping him in terms of wealth. He was basically a land poor aristocrat, minor aristocrat, and these people had the most resentment, I think, of all against what was going on and being displaced by the new nouveau riche families like the Fuggers.
Well, we can go maybe to speaking of economics and profits and that, to go maybe a bit in the present. Do you have some comments? What's your view on these actions of the Fed, basically, and their quantitative tightening, and basically stopping some kind of a recovery and stopping the growth of the stock exchange?
Alan Greenspan formulated the policy. He said basically the Fed is there to take the punch bowl away once the party gets going. So now you've got this situation where the money is created as debt in the economy. This is you've reached the limits here where you've taken it too far. Okay, if the monetary supply is created as debt, that debt cannot be repaid because it's the money supply. So in other words, you're talking about the totality of all the money there. If it's all debt, where is the interest going to come from? There's nothing outside the economy to pay for the interest. And so therefore, it's doomed to fail. And that is precisely what happens on a regular basis. The last big failure was in 2008, 2007, 2008, where a number of banks failed because they were overextended. It's the classic story of every single bank in history. Okay, you lend money on a floating loan. After 70 years, that loan becomes unrepayable, and the economy collapses. Okay, it happened to Habsburgs. The Fuggers were their bankers. The Fuggers bragged that they never charged the Habsburgs more than 5%, which was really low at that time. The Habsburgs, during this period of time, came into the possession of every single gold and silver mine in the New World. And this money was pouring into their coffers. The first loan they took out with the Fuggers was, I believe, in 1494, 95, right around the time that Columbus discovered America. In 1555, the Fuggers went bankrupt, even though they owned every gold and silver mine in the New World, because loans at this point, a floating loan at this point, because of the exponential growth of compound interest becomes unrepayable. And so the Habsburgs went bankrupt. That situation replicates itself over and over again throughout history. Any floating loan becomes unrepayable. So to take it forward a little bit, the Bank of England is created in 1690, so about 94, something like that, around 200 years after the Fuggers made their first loan. By 1760, it's unrepayable. Lord Townsend goes to Adam Smith and says, what are we going to do? And Adam Smith says, basically, there's nothing you can do because a floating loan is unrepayable. Everybody knows that. It wrecks every culture that allows itself to be in this position. But then Smith said, well, maybe, I have an idea. Let's have the colonies pay for it. And so they started with the Stamp Act in America, and that led over a course of the next 13 years into the American Revolution. So once again, it created history. So the point here is that Any government that gets in debt at this point and finally realizes it's in an unrepayable situation will cause a revolution. There will be a revolution, and that's the only solution to the problem. So to give you the contemporary situation, that's the only solution in Greece right now. Greece is being plundered. Greece is being plundered. Every time they roll over their loan, they have to give up new concessions, whatever it is. All of the resources that Greece has that allow them to make money are being plundered by the bankers who are stealing this from them and then giving them rolling over their loan, which only gets them deeper in debt. They get deeper in debt and they have less and less means to pay back the loan. You can't get out of that situation. You have to there is no economic solution to this. There is only a political solution, and the political solution is basic revolution, overthrowing the regime and defaulting on your loan. There is no other solution. The question is then, well, how is Greece going to do this? What kind of army does Greece have to defend itself when it does this? And that's the problem that you see here.
Well, before a revolution, there usually comes a crisis. It's built in, let's say, in this kind of a capitalist system. You will undoubtedly have some kind of a crash or some kind of a crisis. But okay, we're used for with Greek crisis, but I think that the most interesting will be an American one. What can happen easily is basically that the coming crisis will induce some kind of political change, because the current American president takes all the reward and goes with the economy. So if the economy tanks and breaks badly, he will go with it, and the alternative will probably be some kind of a democratic socialist system being elected. If we have some kind of replay of the 2008 crisis, and the chances are that this one will be worse.
Well, they had to give out a couple $1 trillion of quantitative easing. See, this is a classic example of what I just talked about at the beginning of Hungary. Hungary got the money in the government, which is the source of the money, put the money in the hands of the people, anybody who had 4 children. What they should have done with all of these mortgages, it was a subprime mortgage crisis, that basically people could not pay back those mortgages because they were crooked, dishonest, they didn't know what they were signing. And so they started to default, and the defaults started to cascade, and the banks started to fail. And at that point, well, what do? Well, they cannibalized, what did they cannibalize? I forget the name of the bank they cannibalized. Goldman Sachs came out and cannibalized it. They came out, and then Goldman Sachs got made whole at full face value on their crappy loans. That never should have happened. This is Obama collaborating with the oligarchs to the crooked system that is in America. What they should have done is saying, okay, you're bankrupt. We're taking over. All of the creditors get a haircut, which means we're only going to pay you pennies on the dollar. Trump was a master of this. He knew how to manipulate the system. He went through 3 bankruptcies. Okay? So Goldman Sachs, you're bankrupt. We're taking over your assets. Your creditors get pennies on the dollar. And at this point, their assets would have decreased in value. Okay? What they should have done, what they could have done to the people who owned the mortgages is give them the money. Now, if you gave the people that were underwater in their mortgages money, they could have paid off their mortgage, and Goldman Sachs would have gotten their money, and they would have gotten their houses. But that's not the way the system works. Goldman Sachs gets the money. They retain the mortgages at full face value. They are paid off at full face value, and the person who pays is the person who has to default on his loan and give up his house. That's what happened there. That is what's happening in Ireland right now as we speak. When the bubble burst in Ireland, the government bailed out the bankers, the crooked bankers, and that meant all those people in Ireland were stuck with mortgages that were way overvalued, and they are now defaulting on their loans. There was an incident in Ireland where the Irish Republic goons from the Protestant Northern Ireland and to kick somebody out of his house. It caused a big incident, and they had to back down. But I mean, that's the crisis in Ireland right now.
Can you see the situation going into some kind of a radical political shift if this kind of wealth transfer from let's say from the people, from the value they thought they have in their homes, just being wiped away? Can this have an effect
I think
of
we're
introducing some kind of a radical, let's say, leftist government?
We're already seeing the worldwide reaction. Donald Trump was a reaction. He's proven to be a loyal servant of the oligarchs and the Wall Street people that are the villains in our economy. Brexit is a protest, and also the Yellow Vest movement in France. These are all protests against oligarch exploitation, oligarchic arrogance, people ruling their culture, and the average person being taxed to death, especially in France. The initiating factor in France was raising the gasoline tax. Macron is a representative of oligarch interest. He is a stooge of the oligarchs. He is there to represent their interests at the expense of the people. And what he created was a revolution that is continuing there in the tradition of France, which has revolutions on a regular basis.
Well, my country went years ago, before I was born, through a revolution. So supposedly from purely capitalist system, it went to socialist economy, and then back to capitalism. So I can tell you some details firsthand. So basically, in the pre-Second World War capitalist system, you had a bank, and then comes the socialist system, and the bank remains the same, just the CEO are switched. Now don't have a Mr. CEO, you have a comrade CEO.
Yeah.
And then when it is transferred from socialist system back to capitalist system, all the banks remain. Even the CEOs remain. They just switched their titles. So basically, don't go there. I mean, it's a total fraud. You have banking in either system. You just have the oligarchy or the elite swapping seats. That's the experience if you want to do revolutions.
As you're talking about the macro level, the problem's always the same. Where are you, if the bank creates the money supply, where is interest going to come from? Where's that going to come from? There's no place, you can't get it. It's not there. It's not possible. And so the system is condemned to fail. It will fail on a periodic basis. And at that point, the bankers get bailed out at the expense of everyone else, and everyone is poorer over this period of time. They're saddled with debt. That's the biggest problem in the United States of America right now. No one's talking about it because it's too big of a problem. So you have facing us right now with the one issue that will probably bring about the next financial crisis is student debt, student loan debt. There's over $1 trillion in outstanding debt for student loans. These people, this was the whole reason for Occupy Wall Street. I was there. I saw all those. The protesters were all people in their 20s, and they all held signs saying in effect, I'm $80,000 in debt, and all I can get is an unpaid internship. So you have the contraction of labor, and the expansion of credit is a bad idea, and it's doomed to failure, and there's going to be a crash. Because these people are just not in a position to pay back $1 trillion in loans. And along the way, you've got the catastrophe of basically no family formation. These are people who are in the years when they should be forming a family. They should get their first real job. They should get married, and they should start forming a family and buying a house and getting settled. They can't do it because of student loan debt. We are crippling the productive economy here. Debt is strangling the economy. No matter where you look, it's strangling the economy. The main problem here is lack of demand. And the cause of lack of demand is one, exorbitant debt and low wages. They go together. That's why I called my book, Barren Metal, The History of the Conflict Between Labor and Usury. There's an inverse relationship here. The more usury, the lower the wages. The higher the wages, the lower the usury. That's what happened in the United States over this period of time. In the 1970s, wages stopped going up, and that was the time when the credit card got introduced to widespread use, to give you the illusion that you still had money when all your money was basically going to servicing your debt.
Okay, I guess with all this student debt talk, I don't. The main theme, the main discourse is about who will have to pay it. But I never saw somebody ask why is finance this way. Why not to finance it in the equity way? Like.
Well, wait a minute. Let's go back to I for some reason stumbled across the guy who came up with the plan for students. Now, I went to college from 1966 to 1970. When I was in college, it was not unusual for someone to get a decent job that would pay for his that year's education. So you're talking about maybe $1,000 for a year's education. That if you got a decent job, like a decent manufacturing factory job, you could probably earn $1,000 over the summer and pay that off. Okay. At a certain point, there was a man by the name of John Zilber at Boston University in Boston, and he came up with a plan. Well, let's just lend these students, let's say $1,500, because that should pay for your entire 4 years of college, and we'll charge them 2%. I mean, who can argue with that? Well, the problem is, as soon as you let debt in the door, there is no limit to what the college will charge you. And so as soon as same thing with housing, same thing with education. As soon as you get credit involved in housing, the prices, same thing happened with education, to where now you had a Catholic college near me, university, Notre Dame University, which was created so that Catholic immigrants could get a college education with minimal cost. It now costs you $250,000 to get a 4-year undergraduate education at Notre Dame University. Probably more than that now. Well, this is you're forcing students into bondage by doing this across the board. And suddenly, at a certain point, the crooks understood the possibilities here, so they created for-profit colleges, which were nothing but crooked diploma mills, where you run the guy in. As soon as he walks in the door, you get him a loan, and then you take the loan, and then he never gets a degree. There have been lawsuits against these for-profit universities. It's a crooked situation, but all revolving around debt. Debt corrupts the entire economy. Credit, this type of debt, borrowing money, corrupts the entire economy.
Let's jump a bit on science. You just wrote an article about Heisenberg and let's say science. So we have time just to cover science in general. Let's say to sketch some kind of basics. So let's talk about before Catholicism, before Christendom. So there was the pagan world and the Hellenic world. So we had really nice flashes of logos emerging in the Hellenic world, but the whole system was polytheistic. So basically, an idea of science was the sea science was a matter of Poseidon, of Triton. So it was kind of department that depended on this particular god. It was like a world in itself, and had nothing to do with, I don't know, with for example, agriculture or plants that had their goddess, and this was functioning in another world independent from the sea world, let's say so. So when basically this principle universality of one creator and one universal set of laws for everything, and plus the logos some kind of internal order that has to be put in into these things. Well, it made possible for a science to get started. I mean, for the science in today's sense. Do you kind of agree with this?
Well, you brought a lot of issues there that need to be separated out. It's hard for us to forget what we know, and it's hard for us to understand that what we take for granted were not known at another period of history. And one of the things you mentioned was the creator, and the one thing that the Greeks did not have was a sense of the Creator. It just didn't have it. The brightest mind in the world, the brightest minds, two of the brightest minds ever, were Plato and Aristotle, and neither one had a clear understanding of what creation was. We take it for granted. You know, we've grown up in a world that's for thousands of years says, in the beginning God created heaven and earth. That's the beginning, the first sentence of Genesis. And we just take that for granted. It's natural for us. But they didn't have a clue about that. They didn't have a clue. They didn't even know, they couldn't even tell you whether there was a beginning or not. Because Aristotle felt that the world was eternal. Which means it always existed. So was there a beginning if it always existed? Well, it wasn't clear. It wasn't clear to these people. But started off by doing is they lived in the world of Homer, and Homer lived in the world of Hesiod, and Hesiod lived in the world where he talked about gods, because that's all these primitive people could understand, that there's some big agent. This is part of my book, The History of Logos and the Logos of History. That's all they could understand. I just had just finished the chapter in that book on John Battista Vico, who came from Naples. Nobody's ever heard of John Battista Vico. He is the most important philosopher in Europe as far as I'm concerned. He completely saved philosophy from skepticism and from killing itself, which is what it did at the hands of David Hume and the English. He preserved it. He was a Catholic. He understood profoundly how the world had changed by the coming of Christ and how that perfected the philosophy that went before it. But what went before it was these primitive men who were living in fear because they didn't understand anything. And for some reason, the Greeks decided there must be a fundamental principle, there must be a fundamental unity to all of this diversity. And Thales was the first of Miletus, which is on the other, basically Asia Minor now, but the Ionian philosophers were basically physicists, what we would call physicists, and he said, well, it's water. Everything's water. Well, that's a primitive way of, it's a material. And we know what it is, and we're saying, everything must be that. And then they just said, well, probably not. And then Anaximenes said, it's probably air, which is another material thing. And no, probably not. And then Heraclitus said that it was fire. And now we're getting close to the beginning of the era that we're living in now. Because fire, he was living in Ephesus, which was a Persian colony at that point, and the Persians worshiped fire. And fire is energy, and there's something about fire that is kind of unique. Because Heraclitus believed in the Logos, but he believed in action as well. Logos in action, which is fire. It's always the same, and it's always changing. Heraclitus also talked about the river. You could never step into the same river at the same time. The river is always changing, and it's always the same. That's a profound metaphor for what the universe is like. It's always changing, and it's always the same. There's a Logos, but the Logos exists in time. And so what happened is you had the beginning of science here. And eventually, people like Aristotle, they couldn't go any farther because they didn't have the instruments. No telescope, no microscope, so you really can't see fundamental issues. But at this point, there were people like Democritus and later Lucretius who said, everything is little balls bumping into each other. It's atoms and the void. And that is the basis of materialism, and that had a long life, all the way up to the life of Werner Heisenberg. Because what those physicists believed in was basically materialism. That's what everyone believed in at the end of the 19th century in Europe, and that caused problems because materialism is a completely incoherent philosophical explanation of the universe. It just doesn't make sense.
Okay, we traveled now a long way from the Greeks to the Heisenberg and to the nuclear physics. But in the meantime, well, we have to mention, if we are talking about science and Catholicism, we have to mention the let's say, the thing that many view as a breaking point between the two. And so the Galileo issue.
Right.
Well, I see it. There are a lot of American apologists with whom I agree with. They see this Galilean problem as some kind of a battle for a biblical literalism. Well, to me it looks was more like a Christological thing. I mean, they had this view. I mean, they saw the moment of incarnation. I mean, the divine logos becoming flesh. It was the event of such, let's say, magnitude, of such importance, that it has to have some kind of a geometrical consequence, let's say so. So basically, that's their starting point of setting this principle of centrality. And the main opponents of it, I mean theological opponents of it, were basically people that wanted to end Church's hegemony on, let's say, on Church's authority, and the people that didn't see this divine aspect of Christologic of Christ as true. So basically, Protestants and, let's say, some kind of reformers, they stood against this statement from the Church.
Yeah, you had a challenge to Church authority. We're talking about you had a scholastic type of synthesis with Thomas Aquinas, who resolved the problem of the Arabs, of Averroes, who said there are two truths, and C.J. of Brabant was trying to teach that what Aristotle said was true for Aristotle, whether it contradicted church teaching or not was not really, that wasn't his job. He basically said, I'm here to teach philosophy, this is what Aristotle said, and I don't care whether it contradicts church teaching or not. The church couldn't tolerate that, and Aquinas came up with a solution, which was one of the biggest issues was the Arabs was creation, as I mentioned to you. The Quran said the world was created in time because the Quran is simply derived from the Bible. It's just a derivation of Genesis. And Aristotle said the world was eternal. Well, how do you resolve them? Well, Averroes said, well, we're not going to resolve them. Just leave me alone. You have your religion, I'll keep my philosophy. And C.J. of Brabant said the same thing in the Middle Ages, and Thomas Aquinas realized you can't have two truths. Okay? And so he said, look, even if the world was eternal, it had to come into being. And if it had to come into being, it was created. And that resolved the problem here. Because the ancients, as I said before, could not separate time from causality. They're two separate things. And they weren't sophisticated. Even a mind as great as Aristotle was not sophisticated enough to make a distinction between time and causality, because he didn't have an understanding of our Creator, whereas Aquinas did. Creation is not change. Change is going from one state to another. Creation is going from nothing to something, which is totally unique, and the only person that can bring that about is God. And so what you had was a more and more refined understanding of God, up to the point of someone like Aquinas, who basically came up with an explanation of how you could have faith and reason at the same time, and both legitimate without one encroaching on the other. That synthesis lasted for about 70 years and it fell apart, as I said, almost immediately. And the problem was called nominalism, and you had William of Ockham, who ended up in Munich. I ate dinner where William Ockham died of the plague, and basically it disintegrated into Ockham saying, well, there's nothing but particulars, and universals don't really exist, or if they exist, they only exist in the mind, and so they don't have anything to do with reality. And so you're back once again to the Averroism. At that point, you had the Reformation, which destroyed the unity of Christendom. At this point, the entire world, well, let's say the entire European world, is sick to death of this scholastic religious disputation, and realizing that there are lots of things that we can talk about that really don't have anything to do with this. So let's just talk about motion, for example. Let's talk about motion, and that's where Galileo came in, trying to come up with laws of motion in the way of Descartes basically running up the white flag and saying, I don't want to talk about it. I'm sick. Descartes fought in the wars of the Reformation. He fought at the Battle of White Mountain, where the Protestants were defeated in Bohemia, in Prague. So he knew what was going on. Let's just back up. Let's just get away from all of this disputation. Let's back up from history, and let's just propose the world as pure geometry, which is what he did. Res cons, the thinking substance, res extensa, the rest of the universe. It's all pure geometry. Well, at that point, you've lost touch with reality. I mean, I understand geometry. I got nothing against geometry. I got nothing against mathematics, but that is not coextensive with reality, and that's precisely what science was saying. And Western European culture was crippled because of that abstraction. So what you have, the synthesis falls apart. And on the one hand, you have Occam saying everything is particulars, and then you have Descartes saying everything are universals, when it's obviously a combination of both. Logos is obviously a combination of both. It's the one and the many. If you choose one over the other, you're destroying the sophistication of this concept of logos.
Well, maybe to go back to this Averaism, this concept of two truths. I see it very up to date into this in the discussion about quantum mechanics. You have now this, just to forward in time. You have this the physicists being the new philosophers. Let's say taking the primacy of the philosophical force from the astronomers, and now the big discoveries are the electromagnetism, that is basically waves, and the waves are basically propagation into some substance or into some matter, and it's very neat, very clean, this combination of electromagnetism and the ether theory. It even started to connect with mass, with gravity, until the Michelson-Morley experiment.
Right.
So basically, now there is a problem. So now Einstein comes about, and he basically, well, I kind of disagree that he is back materialism, because he did not erase ether altogether. He just made ether, he removed the property of propagating light through ether. He left the ether in being like space-time. Now ether is not space-time, but the electromagnetic radiation is independent from the ether. That are basically particles. Okay, that was the big solution to the problem. But in this instance, you now have lots of physicists saying, but wait a minute, it's okay, it's a particle, but it acts like a wave. So now you have this new, let's say, quantum mechanics, basically describing the particle as a wave. So you have this particle-wave duality, which, okay, one can understand the particle-wave duality, but what you are basically saying, if it's sometimes a particle, sometimes a wave. But in the instance when it's a wave, it must have some medium to propagate into. So basically saying ether exists and does not exist in the same time. So you basically have this old Averaism resurrecting again. And you have,
well, Heisenberg, as I point out in that article, Heisenberg reverted to Averroism. He basically, he came down to the in the end of his life. He essentially refuted materialism or atomism, because if you're saying that there's an ultimate particle, which is what the atom is, which cannot be split, which is what atom means etymologically, Heisenberg would say, no, that's not true. You can keep splitting it. There's going to be no ultimate particle. You can get to the point where you keep splitting it, and finally it disappears as energy. So Heisenberg, at the end of his life, became a Platonist. Read Plato in the original. He was a very well-educated guy. He was like the flower of German culture at that time. And he came to the conclusion that it was basically form, which is what Plato said. So you're back to square one. So the whole 19th century quest of finding the ultimate particle turned out to be an illusion. It was bad philosophy to begin with, and so they should have known that they weren't going to solve that problem. But Heisenberg is the one who basically brought it about. My Heisenberg is that he was still a kind of materialist, and he still felt that if you knew the way these particles operated, you knew something about reality. Well, reality is a lot bigger than that. And so the point of my book was that Heisenberg starts this scientific advisory council. It's mentioned in Plato. It's the rule of the guardians. It's what the Ayatollah Khomeini created as the Valiyat Ifaki in Iran at the revolution. And it's supposed to be the wise men protecting the republic. Well, all he could see was nuclear weapons, and he was still blinded by materialism, even though he refuted it. And so he was incapable of understanding the real threat to Germany at that time, which was not nuclear weapons, it was sex. And so I just got a letter from Barbara Heisenberg, his daughter, and she said to me, how dare you associate my father with sex? What did he have to do with sex? What's the problem here? He was a physicist. Why are you criticizing him? Well, it's very simple. The main weapon in the war against the morals of the German people was Kinsey, who claimed to be a scientist. He was plastered over every single magazine during the 1950s in Germany as a way of destroying the morals of the German people. Heisenberg was the only man who had the credentials to call Kinsey's bluff and say that he was a bogus scientist, and this wasn't science, it was psychological warfare. Heisenberg was the only one with the prestige to do that. He didn't do it. We can speculate why, but I think, especially after reading Barbara's letter, that I just think even if you had talked to him about it, he would just said, this is ridiculous, it's beneath my dignity to do that. And as a result, the Germans remain crippled to this day, which should be of some interest to the people of Croatia because of the natural relationships that Croatia and Germany have. They go way back. Okay, when I was in Mostar right after the war, I met a woman there who had been a refugee in Germany. Her father had been a Gastarbeiter in Germany, and her grandfather had been in the Ustasha. So this connection between Croatia and Germany goes way back, and it should be of significance to the people of Croatia.
It's a whole entire new topic. But just to go back to the Averroism and let's say this quantum mechanics. What I was aiming at is the danger of accepting this notion of two truths and the effect it had on some very important German minds. You also have one physicist that is also contemplating all this duality. It's Schrödinger. It's basically not a German, he's an Austrian. And he has a famous Schrödinger's cat experiment, in which it's mind experiment in which he extrapolates this existence and non-existence in the same moment with a cat that is alive and is dead in the same moment.
Yeah.
Okay, so can you guess what theologian is what is the theologian that is fascinated with Schrödinger and is this simultaneous existence on this Averroism? You have I found 3 articles written by Pope Emeritus Benedict Ratzinger, writing about the duality of light and about about Schrödinger and about the effect of let's say simultaneous dual reality having both.
What it will do is cripple any intellectual development, which is precisely what happened to Islam. Averroes was a man who tried to save intellectual development in Islam from the Asherites, from the people who simply said that God was the source of everything. And he tried to save philosophy, and he failed, because you can't have this duality. It cripples intellectual development, and the same thing is true of European intellectual development, which goes in fits and starts. Sometimes it moves forward, a lot of times it just moves backward. And I'm saying that the whole end of the 19th century was in many ways a failure because of its capitulation to materialism. It was in reaction to the German idealism of the early part of the 19th century, but, both wrong. They're both wrong in their separate ways. and I think that right now we're struggling to reconnect with logos. That's why I'm writing the book, because logos is both of those things. And as soon as you say, no, it's all matter, you've lost contact with logos. I'm trying to bring this back, okay? That you can make statements that are true and real at the same time. You can make contact with reality. You can make contact with being, and we can make decisions based on those. That's certain.
Well, Mr. E. Michael Jones, let's end on it. Thank you very much for your time.
Always a pleasure, Tony.